The Korean War, a forgotten conflict that shaped the modern world. The Korean War, often referred to as the Forgotten War, is one of the most significant yet overlooked conflicts of the 20th century. Fought between 1950 and 1953, it was a brutal and transformative event that shaped the geopolitics of East Asia and the world at large. Despite its profound impact, the Korean War is often overshadowed by World War II and the Vietnam War in popular memory. Yet, its legacy continues to reverberate today, as the Korean peninsula remains divided, and tensions between North and South Korea persist. This video will delve into the origins, key events, and lasting consequences of the Korean War, shedding light on a conflict that deserves to be remembered. The origins of the Korean War. The roots of the Korean War can be traced back to the end of World War II. For decades, Korea had been under Japanese colonial rule, but with Japan's defeat in 1945, the Korean peninsula was suddenly liberated. However, this newfound freedom came with a catch. The Allied powers, primarily the United States and the Soviet Union, decided to temporarily divide Korea along the 38th parallel. The North would be under Soviet influence, while the South would be under American control. This division was meant to be temporary, a logistical solution to facilitate the surrender of Japanese troops. However, as the Cold War began to take shape, the division hardened into two separate regimes. In the north, the Soviet Union installed Kim Il-sung, a communist guerrilla leader, as the head of the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, DPRK. Kim Il-sung was a staunch communist who sought to unify the peninsula under his rule. In the south, the United States supported the establishment of the Republic of Korea, ROK, led by Syngman Rhee, a fiercely anti-communist leader. Both leaders claimed legitimacy over the entire peninsula, and tensions between the two Koreas escalated rapidly. Skirmishes along the 38th parallel became increasingly common, and by 1950, the situation had reached a boiling point. The outbreak of war. On June 25, 1950, the Korean War officially began when North Korean forces, armed with Soviet tanks and artillery, launched a surprise invasion of South Korea. The North Korean People's Army, NKPA, swept across the 38th parallel, catching the South Korean military and its American advisors off guard. Within days, Seoul, the capital of South Korea, fell to the North Koreans. The South Korean army, poorly equipped and unprepared, was forced into a desperate retreat. The situation looked dire for the South, and it seemed as though the entire peninsula might soon fall under communist control. The United States, determined to contain the spread of communism, quickly intervened. President Harry S. Truman, acting under the auspices of the United Nations, authorized the deployment of American troops to Korea. The UN Security Council, boycotted by the Soviet Union at the time, passed a resolution condemning the North Korean invasion and calling for member states to assist South Korea. A multinational force, led by the United States and comprising troops from 15 other nations, was assembled to repel the North Korean advance. The early stages of the war. The early stages of the war were marked by dramatic swings in momentum. The North Korean forces, initially successful, pushed the UN and South Korean troops all the way to the southeastern corner of the peninsula, where they established a defensive perimeter around the city of Pusan. This became known as the Pusan Perimeter, and it was here that the UN forces managed to hold the line. The Pusan Perimeter was a critical moment in the war. If it had fallen, the North Koreans would have gained control of the entire peninsula. However, the UN forces, bolstered by reinforcements and superior air power, managed to stabilize the front. Meanwhile, General Douglas MacArthur, the commander of UN forces, devised a bold plan to turn the tide of the war. In September 1950, MacArthur launched an amphibious landing at Incheon, a port city far behind North Korean lines. The Incheon landing was a stunning success, cutting off North Korean supply lines and forcing them into a chaotic retreat. The operation was risky, as Incheon's tides and narrow channels made it a difficult target. However, MacArthur's gamble paid off, and the landing is now considered one of the most brilliant military maneuvers in history. With the North Korean army in disarray, UN forces advanced rapidly northward, recapturing Seoul and crossing the 38th parallel. By October 1950, they had pushed deep into North Korea, reaching the Yalu River, which marks the border with China. However, this advance provoked a dramatic escalation of the conflict. China, fearing an American presence on its border, entered the war on the side of North Korea. In late October 1950, hundreds of thousands of Chinese troops, known as the People's Volunteer Army (PVA), crossed the Yalu River and launched a massive counteroffensive. The UN forces, unprepared for the sheer scale of the Chinese intervention, were forced into a grueling retreat. The Chinese intervention and the stalemate. The entry of China into the war marked a turning point. The conflict, which had initially seemed like a straightforward fight between North and South Korea, now became a proxy war between the United States and China, with the Soviet Union providing support to the North. The fighting grew increasingly brutal, with both sides suffering heavy casualties. The harsh Korean winters, rugged terrain, and constant artillery barrages made the war a living hell for the soldiers on the ground. One of the most infamous episodes of the Korean War was the Battle of Chosin Reservoir in late 1950. As UN forces retreated from the Chinese onslaught, they found themselves surrounded by Chinese troops in the frozen mountains around the Chosin Reservoir. Despite being outnumbered and outmaneuvered, the UN forces, primarily composed of American Marines, managed to fight their way out in a grueling 17-day battle. The Chosin Few, as they came to be known, became symbols of resilience and determination in the face of overwhelming odds. The battle was marked by extreme cold, with temperatures dropping to -40 degrees Fahrenheit. Many soldiers suffered from frostbite, and the frozen landscape made it difficult to evacuate the wounded. Despite these challenges, the UN forces managed to inflict heavy casualties on the Chinese and execute a successful withdrawal. By early 1951, the war had reached a stalemate. The front line stabilized near the 38th parallel, and both sides dug in for a protracted conflict. The fighting became a war of attrition, with neither side able to gain a decisive advantage. Peace talks began in July 1951, but they quickly bogged down over the issue of prisoner of war repatriation. The negotiations dragged on for 2 years, during which time the fighting continued, albeit at a reduced intensity. The human cost of the war. The Korean War was marked by its brutality and the high civilian toll. Cities and villages were reduced to rubble, and millions of Koreans were displaced. The use of air power by the United States was particularly devastating, with extensive bombing campaigns targeting both military and civilian infrastructure. The North, in particular, was subjected to relentless bombing, which left much of the country in ruins. The human cost of the war was staggering. Estimates suggest that over 2 million Koreans, both military and civilian, lost their lives. Additionally, hundreds of thousands of Chinese troops and thousands of UN soldiers, including over 36,000 Americans, were killed. The war also had a profound psychological impact on those who lived through it. For many Koreans, the conflict was a traumatic experience that left deep scars. Families were torn apart, and many were forced to flee their homes. The division of the peninsula meant that many Koreans were separated from their loved ones, with no hope of reunion. The war also had a lasting impact on the soldiers who fought in it. Many returned home with physical and emotional wounds, only to find that their sacrifices were largely forgotten by the public. The armistice and the legacy of the war. Finally, on July 27, 1953, an armistice agreement was signed, bringing an end to the fighting. The agreement established the Korean Demilitarized Zone, DMZ, a heavily fortified buffer zone that runs along the 38th parallel. However, no formal peace treaty was ever signed, meaning that technically, the Korean War never ended. To this day, North and South Korea remain divided, and the DMZ is one of the most heavily militarized borders in the world. The Korean War had far-reaching consequences. For Korea, the war solidified the division of the peninsula into 2 separate states, each with its own political system and ideology. The North became a totalitarian regime under the Kim dynasty, while the South evolved into a democratic and economically prosperous nation. The war also had a profound impact on the global balance of power. It marked the first major armed conflict of the Cold War and set the stage for future confrontations between the United States and communist powers. The United States emerged from the war with a renewed commitment to containing communism, leading to increased military spending and interventions in places like Vietnam. For the soldiers who fought in Korea, the war was a deeply traumatic experience. Many returned home to a country that seemed indifferent to their sacrifices. Unlike World War II, which was seen as a clear-cut victory, the Korean War was viewed as a frustrating and inconclusive conflict. This contributed to its status as the forgotten war, a conflict that has often been overlooked in the annals of history. Yet, the Korean War deserves to be remembered. It was a pivotal moment in the Cold War, a conflict that shaped the modern world. It was also a war that highlighted the human cost of ideological struggles, with millions of lives lost or forever altered. Today, as tensions on the Korean peninsula continue to simmer, the lessons of the Korean War remain as relevant as ever. It serves as a reminder of the dangers of division, the importance of diplomacy, and the enduring human capacity for resilience in the face of adversity. The broader geopolitical implications. The Korean War also had significant implications for the broader Cold War. It was the first major test of the United Nations' ability to maintain international peace and security. The UN's decision to intervene in Korea was a landmark moment, demonstrating the organization's potential to act as a global peacekeeper. However, it also highlighted the limitations of the UN, as the conflict quickly became a proxy war between the United States and China. The war also had a profound impact on US foreign policy. It marked the beginning of America's long-term military presence in East Asia, with the United States establishing a network of military bases in South Korea and Japan. The war also led to a significant increase in US defense spending, as the country sought to build up its military capabilities in response to the perceived threat of communism. Personal stories from the Korean War. Amid the broader historical narrative, it's important to remember the individual stories of those who lived through the Korean War. One such story is that of Colonel Lewis Millett, a US Army officer who led a bayonet charge during the Battle of Bayonet Hill in 1951. Millett's bravery and leadership earned him the Medal of Honor, and his story is a testament to the courage and determination of the soldiers who fought in Korea. Another poignant story is that of the Korean families who were separated by the war. Many Koreans fled south to escape the advancing North Korean army, only to find themselves cut off from their loved ones in the north. For decades, these families had no way of knowing whether their relatives were alive or dead. Even today, the issue of divided families remains a deeply emotional and unresolved aspect of the Korean War's legacy. The Korean War in popular culture. Despite being overshadowed by other conflicts, the Korean War has been depicted in various forms of popular culture. Films like MASH and The Bridges at Tokyo have brought the war to the attention of a wider audience. The television series MASH, which aired from 1972 to 1983, was particularly influential in shaping public perceptions of the war. Although the show was set during the Korean War, it was widely seen as a commentary on the Vietnam War, reflecting the anti-war sentiment of the era.